this stuff. Hey, what do you know? All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Let me bring my welcome notes up so I can say this. All right. My name is Terry Wilson, and I'm from the Avon, Connecticut Historical Society. I'm joined by my partner, Jennifer Bennett from the Avon Senior Center. Our third partner, Tina Panic, who's from the Avon Free Public Library, could not join us this evening. Welcome to the fifth webinar in our fourth year of educational and informative events covering the people, animals, and land of the Paleo period 12,500 years ago. This is very timely as this is October and it's Connecticut Archaeology Month. As has been our custom for the past 4 years of this series, we welcome those joining us for the first time, and we welcome back those who have been with us on this journey of discovery, which unfortunately does come to an end with this webinar. All 4 years of this series, we've enjoyed partnerships with the Avon Land Trust, the Farmington River Watershed Association, and the Institute for American Indian Studies in Washington, Connecticut. When we began this series in 2021, we were advised by a very knowledgeable team of experts in various fields such as archaeology, geology, anthropology, and waterways. We thank them for their insights and support, which have made the last 4 years of this series a tremendous success. We are bringing this to you thanks to a third-year grant from the Lower Farmington River and Salmon Brook Wild and Scenic Committee. Their funding from the National Park Service, which is from the National Park Service, recognizes the importance of continuing education of all river matters in this country. The origin of this 4-year webinar series is the discovery in 2019 of a deeply buried occupation site along the Farmington River here in Avon, Connecticut. After the very first public presentation of that find in February 2020, we knew we had to find out more. So this began a deep exploration into this incredible time in our continent's history. To learn more about the site here in Connecticut, please visit the Avon Historical Society's website and drop down the page for the Brian D. Jones Paleoindian site. Many of us amateurs had no idea how incredibly important this whole time period in our continent's development was to so many people. Incredibly, tens of thousands have watched these webinars and will continue to do so thanks to the Avon Free Public Library's YouTube channel found on their website. What are some of the topics we've covered these past 4 years? Such as the geology of Western Connecticut and how the Farmington River was formed, 12,500 years of Native American communities in Connecticut, the genetics of the peopling of North America, ancient DNA, Ice Age animals of the New England, Paleoindian foodways and trade networks, hunting techniques of the Paleoindian, LIDAR and surface mapping, macrobotanical analysis of plant evidence, and use-ware analysis of stone tools. We've learned with you, and it has been our honor and pleasure to bring this series to all of our viewers. Tonight, we return to the reason for this series, the Paleo period of our continent, with a webinar entitled Paleo-Indian Discovery of America, presented by Brad Lepper, Senior Archaeologist for the World Heritage Program of the Ohio History Connection in Columbus, Ohio, and visiting professor at Denison University. He will explain the evidence of the very earliest occupation in the Americas, followed by a discussion of the Clovis culture and the extinction of megafauna, including a mastodon he helped to excavate in central Ohio as a case study in the extent to which Clovis people contributed to those extinctions. Dr. Lepper earned his PhD from Ohio State University and has worked on archaeological projects from the mountains of Montana to the forests of Maine. For most of his career, however, he has investigated the ancient indigenous cultures of the Ohio Valley. So during the presentation, put your questions into the Q&A part of the screen, and we'll share them at the end. My partner, Jennifer Bennett, will close out the webinar tonight, and you will all receive a recording of this webinar over the next few days. And this webinar will be added to the YouTube channel of the library's website in about 3 weeks. So please welcome our final speaker in our 4-year series, Dr. Brad Lepper.
Thank you very much, Terry. It's a pleasure to be sort of batting cleanup for this great series. I'm glad to be a part of it. So Terry wanted me to point out something I told her early on, that I actually have some experience in New England archaeology. In fact, this sort of odyssey studying the first Americans goes back even before that. I think I was a sophomore in college and had one of my first archaeology of North America overviews. I'd always known I wanted to be an archaeologist. I didn't know what I wanted to study. I was still thinking in terms of, I don't know, ancient Egypt and Greece and stuff like that. But in this North American overview, it was talking about Paleoindians as part of the first chapters and the first sessions of that class. And I was captivated. And I decided then that that's what I want to study. And for much of my career, I have been studying the Paleoindians. And it seemed to me obvious that if you're an archaeologist or a historian for that matter, it's because you understand that in order to understand the present, you need to understand what came before that. And to understand what came before that, you need to understand what came before that, and so on, all the way back. And in North America, in the Americas in general, this is the foundation of all the cultures that followed it later. So it seemed that we knew so little back then when I was working on my dissertation that it was important to focus on that. And I even decided to do my dissertation on it when it became that. And my advisor was very much against it. He said, Brad, don't try and do a dissertation about Paleo-Indians in Ohio. You'll spend years trying to get enough data to write something and you may never finish. And my response was, well, this is what I want to be studying. And like if a truck runs over me next week, this is the problem I want to be addressing. It's what I think is important. And I did manage to successfully write a dissertation about the Paleo-Indians of Ohio. But this is me in northern Maine working. I was up there for 3 seasons. The first season I was working up in the St. Johns River Valley, and the next two I was working at the Munsungan Lake site, which had a couple of Paleo-Indian components there. So it was a great introduction, and I met Dr. Robson Bonnickson, who has since passed away, but he was a mentor in my early career, and I got to do a lot of stuff with them and the Center for the Study of First Americans that he established initially in Orono, Maine. So who were the first Americans? We have that pretty well answered now. They were the ancestors of contemporary American Indians. They weren't Vikings were here, of course, but they, were only here for a short time and got kicked out, more or less. But they weren't the lost tribes of Israel. They weren't Phoenicians or Romans. They were the Siberians, East Asians who came into North America and were the first people to walk on this land. And now, just how early did they arrive? And that's really an important question that I don't think we've quite answered yet, although genetics has given us a big window into that. But this is a really popular subject. As you can see, it's been on the covers of many of these magazines that we all enjoy. And the human odyssey really, it doesn't begin in North America. It begins, of course, in Africa, where we first became human. And the best evidence now suggests that people were entering the Americas by 20,000 years ago, and by 14,000 years ago, they were sort of all over North and South America. And if there is evidence of people before that, they are people that did not contribute to the genetics of contemporary American Indians. So there could have been previous migrations that were failed migrations. So we may find evidence of earlier peoples, but so far, I don't think there's good evidence that we have. So the people that came to America, there's debate and discussion about the routes they followed. There's the so-called ice-free corridor through those two massive sets of ice sheets that melted back and opened this so-called ice-free corridor. But that didn't happen until after we have some pretty good evidence that people were here. So it's entirely possible that people followed a coastal route. And that would explain a lot of the reasons why we have very early sites on the west coast of South America. So that if these people just simply followed the coastline, coast hopping, that would have allowed them to come in much faster and to get south faster than they would have gotten to south if they'd simply followed that ice-free corridor, especially if it wasn't open yet. The first solid evidence that humans reached America during the Ice Age was uncovered, I think it was 1927, at the Folsom site in Colorado. And we now know the Folsom site dates to about 12,600 to 12,200 years ago. and their spear points are just amazingly beautiful, thin and fluted across most of their faces. This is an exhibit at the it's not what do they call it now? Discover Colorado, the museum there. And it is like that Clovis point in association with the bones of an extinct form of bison, Bison antiquus. So this was the discovery that really opened the door to people were here as far back as the end of the Ice Age, which was a big sea change in our understanding at that time of how long people had been in the Americas. And then just a few years later, Clovis points were found with extinct animals, in this case, mammoths, at Blackwater Draw initially, and then on the right is this Colorado site, the Dent site, that was found a little bit later. Clovis seems to date to between 13,050 to 12,750 years ago. And for a long time, this was thought to be the earliest Paleoindian culture in the Americas. And in terms of what we know about the Clovis culture from Eastern North America, which is what I know best, they lived in small groups. They were highly mobile, maybe not as mobile as some people think, because often they seem to have tools crafted from flints that have come from very far away. Some of that might be due to trading. Some of it might be the history of the migration of that particular group. They came through areas that had some kinds of flint and used it, and then moved into other more distant areas and sort of discarded old points, made out of that exotic to the new region raw material. But they certainly did have a big range. They would have moved following the resources, following, the mastodon herds, following where the nut harvests were. Um, we've had for many years, I think, an exaggerated notion of the Clovis culture as basically only hunting mammoths and in the East, mastodons. But it seems clear that their diets must have been broader than that. Like all hunter-gatherers, they would have taken advantage of the things that were easy to hunt and gather, and perhaps only hunted mammoths and mastodons rarely, but they show up more in the archaeological record because the bones of mastodons and mammoths are much more obvious and can be found more easily than perhaps charred hickory nuts that might have been cooked and eaten by these Paleo-Indian peoples. So I think we have a biased view, or have had for a long time, a biased view of the Clovis people, and that these people probably were more like the traditional sorts of hunter-gatherers we've studied in the ethnographic record, the Eskimo, for example, and less like some kind of super predator that maybe was responsible for eating all the mammoths and mastodons in America, which when I was learning about this back as an undergraduate, I was pretty skeptical of that. Because after all, these are people with sticks and sharp points on the end of it. And some of the species of mammoths, and really all of them, really, the mammoths and mastodons, were all pretty big. And in spite of the fact that maybe they'd never been hunted by people before, once you poke one in the back or in the butt with a spear point, they'll pretty much get around to finding out what caused that and putting a stop to it. Since then, we have found earlier evidence. The Meadowcroft rock shelter in Pennsylvania has really good evidence going back at least 16,000 years. There's some of the stone tools found there. It's in the Pittsburgh area, south of Pittsburgh, but interestingly for me as an Ohio archaeologist, some of the flint found in those deep levels are Ohio flints, like Flint Ridge flint. So the whether or not that reflects a migration of people coming through Ohio and then going into Pennsylvania, or whether it's more of people maybe going back and forth, even at that early time period, I'm not sure. But it is nice to have an Ohio connection, because Ohio so far has no Meadowcroft rock shelter, no pre-Clovis sites, although it's pretty clear based on this evidence from our neighboring state that they were here too at that time. We just haven't found it yet. Now, the Monteverde site in Chile is the site that sort of really uh, broke the whole Clovis myth that this was the Clovis culture was the first culture. Um, these people lived here between 15 to 19,000 years ago. When I first saw Tom Dillahay, the principal excavator at the site, give a presentation on this, it was just mind-boggling. But really, when you look down to it, I mean, they had these houses. It was a big archaeological site that was flooded. And so all this perishable material like wood and cordage was preserved. And it gave us sort of it revolutionized our idea of what Paleo-Indian technology included. It wasn't just stone tools. There were all kinds of things there. And the evidence included house foundations and footprints like the one there. And stone tools were a relatively rare component there. But it just was like another revolution. Clovis was one revolution. Monteverde produced another revolution, showing just how long ago people had been in the Americas. And if they were in South America this long ago, they certainly were in North America, because that would have been the route through which they had come. Maybe they're only following the coast. And so maybe the traces might be restricted to the coast, but there should be evidence out there of people of this antiquity. And then finally, the most recent site to be a real surprise is the White Sand site in New Mexico, where they've got footprints of people alongside footprints of mammoths and sloths and other megafauna, and dates that seem to be holding up of seeds in those layers that say some of these footprints are as early as 21,000 years ago. And this would really be remarkable. This is pushing the limits of the genetic evidence. These might be people that were here before the ancestors of modern American Indians came in, perhaps somewhat later. This might be remnants of one of those failed migrations I mentioned. Or maybe it's just that we haven't read the genetic evidence right, and there were people here earlier, and there might be genetic traces that simply haven't been identified yet. So the most important thing that I think the thing that if you were to go back in a time machine, wherever you're sitting now, and look out the window of the time machine, the biggest difference that you would see are the remarkable suite of animals, especially big game animals, but other kinds of animals as well, that would be in that environment that would be like, wow, there's not supposed to be elephants here. And this is, I stole this from an early National Geographic, and this isn't our region of North America. This is mostly supposed to be in the Yukon, up in the sort of the Bering Land Bridge area. But many of these were present in Ohio, would have been present in Connecticut. But in Ohio, for example, there are horses down there in the lower right. We didn't have horses. We haven't found any fossil horses in Ohio. And there's the American lion there just above the horse's head. The American lion was mostly restricted to the plains. But most of the other animals, the mammoths, the mastodons, the giant elk moose, the giant beaver, these would have been animals that would have been living in Eastern North America. And the next slide is this same picture also from the National Geographic, with all the animals that became extinct by the end of the Ice Age. Not necessarily did they all die off at a single sort of moment in time. The extinctions for many of these were spread out over different times, but by the end of the Ice Age, when you see the next picture, all the animals that are whited out no longer lived in North America after the Ice Age. So we have like a wonderful diversity in mammals in America now, but it's just a shadow of what was here before 10,000 years ago. So it's just staggering to think of this. I mean, we had what was like the Serengeti of Africa, and then such a huge percentage of those animals are gone. And one of the biggest questions in American archaeology as well as paleontology is what caused the extinction of all these animals within a, geologically speaking, relatively short span of time. And usually it boils down to two options. Some people think, well, the arrival of the Clovis people at about that time caused those extinctions. But of course, as we've seen, there were people here before the Clovis culture. And a big part of that model was supposed to be the Clovis people were the first, and they were hunting animals that had never been hunted. I think the term was naive game. So they didn't have defenses evolved to cope with this new super predator that had entered the ecosystem. But if there were people here at much earlier times, And at Monteverde, there's evidence of mastodon hunting. So if they were being hunted that long ago, then perhaps by 12,000 years ago, 13,000 years ago, they would have had defenses. They would have been more capable of overcoming the predation that they might have been focusing at a particularly intense time at that point. Um, the picture in the center there is a Clovis point from Ohio, but it's made out of Wisconsin silicified sandstone. I think it's called Hickston silicified sandstone. So it's a piece of that evidence that the Clovis culture had interactions with people in pretty distant regions. And that's one of our, one of the most beautiful Clovis points we have in the collections of the Ohio History Connection. Then on the right there, which is partly covered by me, the other option, is it the climate change? And this is the big puzzle because all of this happens at the same time. The climate is changing, the climate is warming, the ice sheets are melting back, the different kinds of environmental zones are all getting mix mastered and messed up. And uh, at the same time, people have come into the environment, perhaps much earlier than this particular moment. But the combination is surprising, and well, not surprising, but it makes it all confusing, like to sort out which is the cause and which is just a coincidence. Um, Oh, and then was it something else? There are some people that believe in the so-called younger Dryas impact, that a comet smashed into the ice sheets and caused this abrupt cataclysmic environmental change that caused these extinctions and supposedly caused the extinction of the Clovis culture as well. But this immense article, I mean, I don't know how many 100 pages long it is, but it's a wonderful article that is exactly what it says it is in the title, a comprehensive refutation of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And this hypothesis of this comet shows up in a lot of popular culture too, like some of the work of Graham Hancock on the Netflix shows that you may have watched. And this just comprehensively goes through all the things that have been claimed to support the hypothesis and shows that it's all just bunk. And this is from the abstract. There is no support for the basic premise of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis that human populations were diminished and individual species of late Pleistocene megafauna became extinct or were diminished due to catastrophe. And this is particularly obvious, like the Clovis culture did not disappear. On the Great Plains, it evolves into the Folsom culture. And the Folsom people were more populous than the Clovis. So there's no population decline. There's a pretty regular increase in population over time, insofar as we can read it in that early archaeological record. So no evidence of populations being diminished, no evidence of late Pleistocene megafauna becoming extinct due to a catastrophe. So I was able to make a contribution to this early in my career. I hadn't been working for the Ohio History Connection, I think, more than a couple of years when a mastodon was uncovered at construction associated with a golf course just south of the museum where I was working. I had been hired to be the site archaeologist and curator for the Newark earthworks, two Hopewell era, 2,000-year-old gigantic geometric earthwork sites, which we've just had, as part of another bigger nomination, listed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. So some of y'all have to come down and see these earthworks if you haven't seen them. But this presented an opportunity, this discovery of a mastodon. It was kind of fortuitous because I thought I'd turned my back on Paleoindian studies and was now going to be focusing on Hopewell. But then, sort of in my essentially backyard of Licking County, suddenly there's this mastodon. And I was able to go look at it. We'd gotten this phone call basically that said, oh, this guy thinks he found some big bones. And I'd been to look at sites of big bones before, and usually they were cows or horses, but this turned out to be a mastodon. And it was found at this golf course. The picture on the right is their modern card. It was only a 9-hole golf course at the time, and they were expanding it to an 18-hole golf course. And there was this boggy area that they were digging up to make a water hazard. And in digging it, they were finding a lot of rich peat. And they said, oh, this will be great fertilizer for our greens. So they started mining that fertilizer. And it turned out that this had been like a kettle lake, a glacial lake from the late Pleistocene times that had gradually filled in over the millennia. And this is an aerial view of that site while we're working on it. The arrow is pointing at where the burning tree mastodon skeleton was found. You'll notice the snow. So this discovery was made in December of 1989. And these are perhaps the most challenging archaeological excavation circumstances I've ever experienced. The wind chill factor was below zero. It was a wet environment, so your clothes would get wet and you'd come up out of it, and then your clothes would freeze and you'd start, having hypothermia symptoms. But we worked. Initially, the guy said he'll give us 1 day to dig the mastodon. And later, by the end of that day, when we hadn't done a lot, he extended it to 2 days. So we did it in 2 days. So it was pretty rough archaeology. But in fact, we didn't think it was an archaeological site at all. So there on the left is the first view I had of the site. I took this picture. I'm there in the early morning, and it's like, yes, that's absolutely a mastodon or maybe a mammoth, because we have both of those in Ohio. And I'd said, can you fill it back in and we'll dig it up in the spring? And you guys know I want to get my golf course up and running. If you don't dig it up now, I will. And there it is. It was like 20 degrees, but like with a wind chill factor below that. So we scrambled to get a crew together, to get supplies together. And it really does. I think I maybe have a slide that says this, take a village to do it. There it is. Because we got the local school board they had recently bought the old tuberculosis sanitarium in Newark, and they gave us the laundry room in the basement to use as our lab. Those young men were students of the Licking County Joint Vocational School. I think the entire senior class was donated to the project. We got burlap from a local feed mill, boxes from a local moving company, and our biggest priority, because these bones had been sitting in water for millennia, and our biggest problem was once they came out of the ground, and if they started to freeze, the water in them would expand and would cause severe damage to the bones. So our highest priority, we got them out, wrapped them up in wet burlap, put them on the truck, and took them to that laundromat, the laundry area for this old sanitarium, and get them in the warmth where they could dry out gradually. But that center picture was what greeted us when we came back, because we said we need to go get a crew. He said, okay, how much time do you need? And we said 2 hours. So he said, okay, 2 hours. It was like 2 hours and 20 minutes when we got back, and they'd already taken the bones out of the ground that they could see. So we took care of those bones and then went back into the hole to see what else there might be. So since this was in this filled in glacial lake, our assumption was that this mastodon, maybe in the middle of winter, had gone out on the ice, broken through the ice, and drowned and sunk to the bottom. And sort of that would explain why it's in the middle of this pond or lake. And that seemed logical. And in that case, we said, okay, so we don't have to take all the care and caution we normally would on an archaeological site, because this is a paleontological site essentially, and we're just salvaging it to get the bones out so that they can be studied by paleontologists, presumably. But as it turned out, and if we hadn't been so rushed, I mean, we're working 12 or 14-hour days for 2 days in the freezing cold. And if I'd had time to think for like 5 minutes, all these discoveries we kept making throughout these 2 days would have provided evidence that this isn't a mastodon that fell through the ice and sank to the bottom. Something else is going on here. So this is day one. That's me with the Cleveland Indians hat on. And this is how I tell the difference. The next day I came out with a warmer hat and I had my Cleveland Browns wool cap on. And next to me there is Todd Frolking, a soil scientist from Denison University, who was really helpful coming out. And one of the things I'm showing you on the right there, it's hard to see, that's actually a leaf that was uncovered in this, just to show you the incredible preservation of this site. We found spruce cones and pieces of spruce wood and intact leaves. That leaf in that picture when I first exposed it, I pulled up this clod of dirt looking for bones, and that showed up. It still was a shade of green. And I tried to get my camera to take a picture of it, but wading through the muck and taking my gloves off and freezing my hands and coming back with my camera, it had turned brown just in a matter of minutes. But I took the picture anyway, just because I could, share the story at least of it having been green when I first exposed it, which was kind of cool. So this is day one. We excavated the rest of the area where that sort of first cluster of bones was. And this is Todd and I digging there. And actually, no, this is the second cluster. So the construction crew removed the first cluster. This is the second cluster that we'd located. And this cluster consisted mostly of the ribs and the vertebrae. And it was separated from that first cluster of bones by 3 or 4 meters, some distance. The second day, we had lots of television out because the news got out, and several different television stations were out there interviewing us. And this was sort of my supreme moment. This was really funny. This was a guy, a reporter, who was like, I don't know, wearing really expensive suit, had probably shoes of and some incredibly rare leather, and he's standing there, and they got me mic'd up down in the pit, and they said, "What's it like down there?" And I had this almost irresistible urge to say, "Why don't you come down here and find out?" But instead, I gave them the magic sound bite. I said, "It's incredible. It's as close as you could get to a time machine to the Ice Age." And that shows up on CNN and, of course, the local Columbus stations. So yeah, my 15 minutes of fame there. This is what I sort of revealed when Todd and I were first doing that close work with the trowel. We were exposing the ribs, and you can see the heads of the vertebrae there too. And I wanted to get down to the level at which the bones were occurring and getting those pieces of spruce wood that you can see on the bottom, which were the first things we used for radiocarbon dating. And the dates came back, as it turned out, much older than the mastodon bones. And after we thought about it for 15 minutes or 5 minutes, it was like, oh, that makes sense because the mastodon bones were sort of sinking down into this murky ooze, and there was already wood down there. So the bones sank to a deeper level than the actual level that dates to when those bones were introduced to the pond. And bone cluster 2 consisted entirely of ribs and thoracic vertebrae. So then it's like, oh, do we have it all yet? So then we adopted a strategy of using rebar to probe the bog. And as we were probing, we hit hit bones in a third location. So here's the third location, and you can still see the rebar we're using. And this consisted of the 2 front limbs, including the feet, but almost all the toes were missing, which again was one of those things that should have set off a bell in my head. And also next to it, the cervical vertebrae, the neck vertebrae, upside down in a pile. And it looks like part of that's covered by the pictures there. But, and well, let's go to the next map. This is a map of the clusters, and they're not complete because by this time we were working with Dr. Dan Fisher from the University of Michigan, who is probably one of the world's experts on mastodons. And I called him shortly after we'd finished the excavation to see if he'd help us out. And he produced this map based on all the pictures we took and all the video that was taken by folks to show approximately how the bones were associated. And you can see here that this isn't a mastodon that fell through the ice and sank to the bottom. Because if it was, we would see the whole skeleton just as it was, because this wasn't a high energy water environment where bones were being tumbled around. The bones were separated in 3 discrete piles. Cluster 1 included like the head and the pelvis and one of the rear legs, also the scapulae, but those didn't show up in a picture. Cluster 2, there were many more ribs and vertebrae than what's shown in that, but that's just because they didn't show up in the pictures. They had been removed before a picture was taken, for example. And cluster 3 should also include the lower limbs. Those are the upper arm bones of the mastodon, but we were digging those and we had to go deeper for those. and we were digging into an area where there was like a dam with water on the other side, and water was leaking through the side of the excavation, and we were worried the dam was going to break and flood the excavation. So we very hurriedly excavated the rest of those bones. And the feet were at the end of the front limbs, and I'm pulling those bones out with my hands with rubber gloves on them, pulling those out piece by piece. And so if the finger bones had been there, since I'm using my fingers and hands to get in that muck and pull them out, I would have seen them. I would have felt them. Mastodon finger bones aren't that small to begin with. So, but since we weren't using all the other techniques of archaeology where we're screening the muck, we could have missed some things, but not all the mastodon fingers because I was hand excavating those in that case at that moment. I would have felt them. So this is what Dan Fisher calls his roadkill diagram. It shows all the bones we found, which are all the ones that are colored in. If they're left white, we never found them. And they're color coded by their which pile they were in. So red is the first pile that we found, the blue is the second, and the green is the third. And you'll see, so in addition to we're missing most of the right rear leg, we're also missing most of the fingers. But other than that, oh, we're missing the left kneecap for some reason, although we have the right kneecap, which is puzzling. But anyway, so that shows you sort of it's nearly a complete skeleton. And even though it was separated into these different piles. Now, one of the things Dan suggested we do, we had to it's sort of like having a baby again, because the bones, he said, if you just leave them water saturated sitting in that room where we had them, the water would be evaporating up through them to exit, and it would form vents in the bone to exit the bone. And over time, those vents would get bigger and bigger and wider. So he said you should like rotate those bones every initially like 6 or 7 hours or something. And then as the weeks went on, then it was like, okay, now you just have to do it once a day. And so it's like, yeah, getting up in the middle of the night and taking my shift to go into this facility and flip all the bones over. And then he said the tusks are even different. He said the tusks are really difficult. It's sort of like somewhat analogous to a tree in that there are rings. And then he said if you let that dry naturally, the outer rings, the outer surface of the tusk dries first, cracks, and then might even spall off. And then the next ring would crack and dry off and spall off, and you might end up with just a pile of fragments. So he said what he found is that the best thing to do is saw it in half, long way, and then you're letting it dry slowly from the inside out. And then he said you get a benefit from that too, because by sanding down the inside of that tusk, you can see the growth layers. And it's amazing the data he's gotten, not just from this burning tree mastodon, but from other mastodons he's studied and elephants as well. There are growth rings that are like every couple of weeks, there's a new ring deposited. And as you can see, the dark bands in that polished section there represent winters when the mastodon is not growing as much as it would during times when it's getting more to eat. And the wider light bands are sort of spring, summer, fall when they're able to have more food. And I can't remember now. I think the animal turned out to be 27 years old or something. It was a young male, fully mature, but hadn't been mature for long. And the top there is the moment the animal died. So that's the pulp cavity. That was growing when the animal died, and that was growing sort of right at the end of the summer. So into the fall, just before winter. So that's not a time when the animal would be starving to death. So it didn't die of starvation. And we have another line of evidence to indicate that that's the case too. So it's like, well, what caused this animal to die? And then what caused its body to get distributed in 3 piles of disparate bones? Well, initially, when we're cleaning the bones, and Dan was very clear, he says, don't use brushes to clean the bones. Then you'll be introducing, damage or marks to the bones. Just rinse them with water. And in doing so, we found these marks on some of the ribs that could be cut marks. But on the other hand, they're pretty crude So one option was maybe they were marks made by a carnivore, chewing on the bones. But then we found one of the only complete fingers, and you're looking at this is actually the ring finger, the left front. What is that? The third finger. Second depends on which finger you're counting from. But right on the sort of I guess this is on the outside actually. There are these deep cut marks that we looked at them. And I may have this slide now with a scanning electron microscope, and they fit all the characteristics of a stone tool cut mark. And Dan said he's seen these on other mastodons and mammoths, and he says it's where the Paleoindians are butchering the mastodon and they're severing the tendons, and then they use the fingers to help pull off the hide. Excuse me. So that explains, if that's what happened, why we've got cut marks where we've got them here and why the fingers are gone. They went with the hide. Here's the scanning electron microscope picture. On the left is one of those cut marks on the inside of the finger or outside finger where the tendon would have been. And it has all the characteristics of a stone tool cut mark. Dan also found these other marks on the bone that look for all the world like drag marks. They're all in the same direction, and it's as if that bone was dragged across a sandy or gravelly surface, and it left all these scratch marks on that part of the bone. So there's an indication that somehow, whether naturally through some natural process or maybe through humans moving it around, it was exposed to abrasion. Okay, and then this is the inside of a scapular epiphysis. So an epiphysis is sort of like the end of a bone, and it's growing, and it eventually, as the animal ages, it will fuse to the bone and become part of the bone. But this animal was young enough that it had not fully fused and it had come off, and it's full of these nooks and crannies that help it sort of securely fasten to the other part of the bone. And those had filled in with muck. And since we couldn't scrape them clean, we only rinsed them, some of that muck stayed in those holes. And as it dried, that muck peeled back. And in these cases where the arrow is pointing, it points to sand and some kind of small gravel that were up against the bone and covered with the muck. Um, there wasn't sand or gravel of any sort in the bog. So this seems to indicate that where this, bone, bloody bone encountered sand and gravel might have been outside the bog somewhere and then had been transported to I keep saying bog. Back then it was a pond, a lake, small lake. So when it was introduced to that small lake, it had this grit on it stuck to it from the bloody surface from some other source. So I think I didn't mention that on another slide because it was partially covered, but this is sounding a lot like CSI Ohio, 13,000 years ago. And it is very much like that. This is a diorama we had at the Ohio History Connection that was made long before the burning tree mastodon was uncovered, but it's kind of remarkable in the way that it could represent the burning tree mastodon, because the guy on the sitting on it, sort of cutting off the stuff around the ribs, could be leaving knife marks like what we found on the ribs. And they've taken one of the leg bones over there in the upper left-hand corner and are busting it open for marrow to eat sort of on the spot as a snack, I guess. That would have accounted for why we're missing one of the leg bones. But it also may be that that bone was still out there and we never saw it, and it simply got sort of dug up with the rest of the stuff. But we actually went back and looked at the spoil dirt piles because they were conserving all those piles to use as fertilizer. If there were any big bones there, we would have found those too. So Dan Fisher presents this argument that he thinks Paleo-Indians killed that mastodon or maybe encountered its dead carcass, cut it up into chunks, and dragged it to this pond and intentionally sank it in the icy water so that it could act as a Paleo-Indian meat freezer. And this, I'll come back to this thing, this kind of changed a lot of my thinking about whether Paleo-Indians could have had anything to do with the extinction of the mastodons. And I'll come back to that. Dan also decided to do an experiment, a draft horse of a colleague of his at the University of Michigan, died of natural causes. Her name was Mona, and her body was donated to science. And you can see Dan Fisher there on the left using stone tools to butcher the animal. And he cut off bone segments and sunk them in Michigan lakes, broke through the ice, sunk them down in there, and would come back and monitor those from month to month to see how long bones could be preserved in that kind of environment. And he did that for an entire year, and the meat was still edible. It had turned a little bit raunchy, that had a crust develop on it, but it was tested for bacteria and it had no bacteria. People could eat it. He said his wife would never let him actually try and eat it, but it was safe to eat. So at least a year, this meat could be preserved in these kinds of caches in lakes. Now, I was teaching part-time at Denison at that time, and one of my students as a project went to all the neighboring farms around this site, and in one farm collection, they had these 3 Clovis points. Now, the Clovis point lasted for centuries. So these points might have had nothing whatsoever to do with the burning tree mastodon, but they're in sort of the right place at around the right time to perhaps have been the kill site where the animal was killed. And these got left behind somehow there. And then when it was butchered, and then the carcass butchered and dragged to the pond. So it's just interesting that we have from very nearby points of the right age that could have been responsible for killing the burning tree mastodon. Well, there's more to this story too, and I probably don't want to spend a lot of time, but in a process of our excavation, this was that first day when we were doing the rib cage, I had read about mastodon gut contents having been found with mastodons. And I was looking really carefully in this area where the ribs were to see. This was one of the only times in the whole excavation that I got my trowel out for this. And I'm scraping the ground carefully. And what I'd read about before with the 3 or 4 mastodons in Ohio that had gut contents, it was a large mass of chewed up spruce branches. And the picture there is from one of the Ohio History Connection articles about this that talked that mastodons apparently ate spruce and maybe nothing else. And I'm not a paleontologist, but that had never made a lot of sense to me because it didn't seem like spruce had a lot of food value. But anyway, so what I was looking for was a big, semicircular mass of chewed up spruce branches and didn't find it. What I did find was a long, I don't know, maybe as much as a meter, but 3 feet or something. It turned out to be cylindrical, but a sort of a stripe in the black or dark brown peat that was more like liver colored. It was more reddish brown, and it stunk like a sewer. And I'm looking at that like, what the heck is that? Those aren't spruce chunks in there. This isn't doesn't appear to be like the stomach contents. So I asked Todd, that he's the geologist and soil scientist, says, Todd, come over here and look at this. What do you think about this? And he says, it could be anything rotting away in the bog here. And I said, well, yeah, I suppose. But I wanted to take samples of it so that we could at least look. Took several samples, put them in plastic bags, put brief labels, and set them on the side of the dig, and then forgot about them. At the end of the day, I go, oh God, what are those samples? And I went back and they were frozen solid. So I was like, oh crap, if we take these back to the lab, they'll thaw out and get mildewy before we can do anything with them. One of the guys, maybe from the construction crew, said, well, hey, I've got a freezer in my garage that I use for deer meat. I can put them in there for you. It's like, awesome. So that's what they did. Oh, yeah, let me back up again. So let's see. A couple months later, a team from Ohio Wesleyan is going to come out and core the bog, what's left of it, because by then most of it had been dug up, and look at the different pollen and plant material through time. And we were showing them the mastodon and talking about this. And let's see. Well, I'm getting all out of order here. When we took those samples, we sent some of those to a paleoethnobotanist, and this is what she found in them. And this is what we think now, as you'll see in a minute, relates to mastodon diet. And actually, I can show you that it really does relate to mastodon diet. On the left are some chewed up not coniferous, but deciduous plants. but they found spruce twigs, needles, and bark, grass, sedge, pondweed, water lily, and moss, all in this sort of chewed up mass. And this now we think reflects that mastodons had a much broader diet. This is what the Ohio Wesleyan team that was in looking for plants, we were showing them the mastodon, and I was telling them this story about finding these, possible gut contents. And that guy, who wasn't wearing a suit at the time, raised his hand in the back and he says, if you think it's the stomach contents or the gut contents, have you looked for intestinal bacteria? And in my wisdom of everything I knew about microbiology, I said, oh, no, no, this is 13,000 years ago. There's not going to be any bacteria. And he said, well, my name's Jerry Goldstein, and I'm a microbiologist. And yes, there could be. What did you do with the samples? And I said, well, they were frozen. And he said, did you keep them frozen? And I said, yeah. And he says, well, then if you give me some samples, I can go back to the lab and test them to see. And we said, sure, take a sample. And he revived essentially this species of Enterobacter cloaca, um, proving that this was from an animal's guts. And the only animal there, was the mastodon. So it became clear that this is mastodon guts. And so we're not the team of excavators, we're not completely convinced. Maybe let's get somebody else to look at it. And so Dan Fisher recommended we send samples to the Center for Microbial Ecology. And I think that's at Michigan State, a highly prestigious institution, to see if we could get confirmation. Not only did they provide confirmation, they found many other species of bacteria that only live in animal intestines. And we gave them samples of the peat itself. They found living bacteria there as well, but they were only species that lived in fresh water. So it more or less conclusively shows that the guts we had were from the mastodon, and thereby the stuff that's in it reflects mastodon diet. And this made quite a splash. We had New York Times headlines, London Daily Telegraph, we were in National Geographic, and Discover magazine listed us as one of the top 50 science stories of 1991. And it's there, like right between homosexual brains and the 4,000-year-old man, mastodon meals. And here's that Michigan microbial ecology study. They found many more species of bacteria that only live in animal intestines. And Dan Fisher had found gut contents associated with the Heisler mastodon in Michigan. And it was the same suite of species that were found in the gut contents of the Heisler mastodon as had been found in the burning tree mastodon, which again goes to show this is mastodon intestines. The gut contents there reflect mastodon diet. So we changed people's ideas about diet. We've found evidence that people were hunting mastodons and caching them in ponds, and we found living intestinal guts bacteria. Now, the owner eventually sold the burning tree mastodon to the Kanagawa Prefectural Museum of Yokohama, Japan. So that's where you have to go to view the mastodon. But we do have casts of it. In fact, right behind me is a cast of one of the tusks that was given to me years later by a guy that was working for the owner after the owner passed away. So, in a sort of conclusion, what then does the burning tree mastodon tell us about the late Pleistocene extinctions? In my early years of studying Paleoindians, as I think I sort of alluded to, I didn't think people living in very low density across the landscape, with sticks and pointed flint points, on the end of it, could have been that devastating a predator, especially if they're not the first, humans in that landscape, that there are humans before that could have sort of taught mastodons how to avoid humans from killing them, or mammoths. So how did they, with a stick and a stone, kill all of these different animals, mastodons, mammoths, giant ground sloth, giant bear, giant beaver? How did they kill them all in a very relatively short period of time with sticks and stones? So I was very skeptical. But and it's because, as I mentioned earlier, they lived in small bands. So even if a small band kills a mammoth or mastodon, um, they're not going to be able to take full advantage of the meat. So you're risking the lives, literally, of some of your group, who might get stomped on or speared by a tusk, um, hunting a very dangerous animal when you could be out hunting deer or elk, which are also in the landscape at this time, that are much less ferocious. So why would you do it? Well, if they had the capability, as the burning tree mastodon shows they did, to take that meat, and you're hunting sort of right before winter. So to take that meat and preserve it for as much as a year, then you have access to all of that meat through the winter when it's really hard to make a living hunting and gathering. And so it would be a way, yes, it's worth the risk to hunt a mastodon maybe one a year, at the just before winter, because you're able to cache it and have meat for the whole winter. And why this particular cache was not fully recovered, there's still bones there. It may be because the people that cached it had some kind of disaster and weren't able to come back. It may be that the winter was a light winter and they had plenty of deer to eat and fresh meat that would have been tastier. But for some reason, this cache of three separate concentrations of bones in this Ice Age lake were never recovered. Some of them may have been recovered. Maybe that's they came back and took one leg bone out for, one series of dinners and then never came back. But that's part of the story we're probably never going to know. But it does suggest that if one small group killed one mastodon every winter, enough of those groups are around Ohio. Mastodons have this very long gestation period. So you kill one or two or three or four, and that sort of gets magnified across the country. Maybe you're putting enough of a dent to cause, along with the stress from climate change and the changing vegetation, along with that, to really tip those animals over into extinction. And mastodons would be like elephants in Africa. They're what's called a keystone species. In other words, the elephants modify the landscape to the benefit of all these other species. And if you take the elephants out, a lot of those species go extinct because they're not able to exploit the habitat that the elephants had created for them. So if that happened in America, the mastodons and the mammoths become extinct, the habitats change markedly such that the other animals can't make a living. There's kind of a domino effect, and that could account for these mass extinctions and why they're not instantaneous in time, why they sort of drag out over time. So that's the end of my formal presentation, but I want to provide answers to any questions you all might have. And I want to thank Terry Wilson, president of the Historical Society, for the invitation to give this presentation. And a shout out to Ken Fader for pointing her in my direction. So thank
Yes,
you all very much.
Ken is on this webinar. I see him on there, so I know he's there. Thank you. Appreciate that very much. That was fabulous. I do have a couple of questions, but if anybody does have any they'd like to put into the chat or the Q&A, please do that now. That would be great. Real quick, the Clovis to Folsom tie. You said that the Clovis people led to the Folsom people.
Yeah.
Is there a direct genetic connection, or was that just because there was another group of people who came in and they intermingled?
I think we can infer a direct connection because Clovis DNA is found in the DNA of contemporary American Indians. So that would suggest that all the stages in between are
Oh,
continuous DNA, that there's not introductions of other people. And where Clovis seems to cover much of North America, even into Mexico, of course, and that's part of North America, Folsom is really only concentrated on the plains. I don't think we found any Folsom points in Ohio. Or they probably, if they were, they would have been restricted to probably the expansion of the Prairie Peninsula. But Folsom is much more restricted in time as well as in space, and it does seem to be focused on bison hunting, bison antiquus on the plains, whereas Clovis is everywhere and probably had a more diverse sort of subsistence pattern. They hunted different things in different regions. Folsom is sort of a very focused adaptation to the plains.
okay, great. And then the other question I have is the white sands, because that was big in the news in the last couple of years and finding the footprints. How long is it going to take, do you think, to really confirm that that is what it is? Is it really just the seeds, or is there more that has to be done?
It's like with the initial sort of debate over is Clovis the oldest. You've got some people committed to the idea that people can't be here that old. So they're extreme skeptics. And on the other hand, they should be, because it's very consequential to say people were here at such a not ridiculously early date, but at a date that's very surprising in terms of everything we already know. Now,
Mhm.
it's not surprising that we'll make discoveries that are, change our ideas about things. That happens. But to have the genetic evidence say people might have been in Beringia 20,000 years ago, but people are only in North America 16,000 years ago. And have the genetic evidence be telling us that, and then to find down in New Mexico 21,000-year-old humans, that's maybe not an extraordinary claim, but it's a claim that goes against what the evidence says now. So it really should be held to scrutiny. And people have said, well, the seeds you're dating are contaminated by old carbon in the water of that glacier, that lake.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
and so that's making the dates look too old. And they said you should date other things. Well, the team has come out with a new paper that they've dated other things. They've dated pollen. They've dated and they've got concurrent dates. And people are saying, oh, well, maybe the pollen grains were of many different ages and they just happened to average out to exactly the same date that the seeds dated to. And I think that's stretching it. It's it's
Mm.
it's good to be skeptical. It's good to require, evidence of such a remarkable claim, to be confirmed as well as you can. But I think the team has done a very good job in their second paper of sort of doing everything that was asked of them in the first paper. Date some things that aren't contaminated by this water. That it looks to me, it's still early days. People are still arguing about it, but I'm leaning towards accepting that data as valid unless someone can demonstrate that it's not,
Okay, that makes sense. I think
which
that
is
all
very exciting.
it is. It's very good because yeah, that can absolutely shine more light on things, make it better. Ken Fader did chime in to say that you did a great job, Brad. And he also wants to remind everybody about the nearly complete mastodon skeleton that was found in Farmington, Connecticut. I believe is a little over 100 years ago. It was at Hillstead. It was on the property of what is now Hillstead Museum. And I understand that that mastodon, the Pope mastodon, is now in storage at the University of Connecticut in the archaeology department. But there was no evidence of human hunting it. That's never has been found. So that's just an interesting piece there. I believe, let's see, I have a question. Okay, somebody has a question, but is not typed it in yet. Let's,
Okay.
we have a couple of other comments from other people. It's one of the best presentations in the series. And so I'm
Oh
glad.
my goodness. Thank you
Oh,
very much.
I know, that's fabulous. And I don't know if there's anything else. Jen, do you have any questions? Oh, you're muted. You're muted, Jen.
Here
Oh,
we
there you
go.
are. All
This
right.
was so great, Brad. I learned a lot. There's words I didn't know, but most of the words I knew. I was so excited. And I love your energy around this topic and the way you presented it. It was just, it gets you excited to do things and learn things that you never knew you would want to. So I thank you so much. I'm going to
Thank
listen
you.
to it. I'm going to listen to it again because I need to get everything.
Right.
I succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. So thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you. Jen, do you want to do the close? And I think want to just thank everybody for being with us for these 4 years, for everything that we've done.
Yeah.
And please go
Mhm.
back and please watch the webinars again. Everything's available on the Avon Library website. And Jen,
Mhm.
it's all yours. Thanks, Brad.
So we want to thank everyone for joining us for all of these years. This has been such an exciting series. Every year there's different information, but the series as a whole has really been so, I mean, really mind-blowing in such a positive way. We've met some amazing presenters like Brad tonight, and Ken Fetter, just amazing presenters and people who are experts in their field and bringing information to us. And everybody's been cooperative with Zoom. So thank you for putting up with all our technology over the years. I do want to again shout out to the Avon Historical Society, the Avon Free Public Library, and the Avon Senior Center in partnership with the Avon Land Trust, Farmington River Watershed Association, in the Institute of American Indian Studies in Washington, Connecticut. We want to thank everybody who's been with us. Please don't forget that these are all recorded. So if you would like to go on the library's website, you can get access to them and you can show them. We will be showing them at the Senior Center as well. So pay attention to our newsletters and we can get everyone linked up with those. So somebody has a question about paleolingui. I hope I pronounced that right. Lingui.
I don't know what that is.
I'm not sure either.
Yeah, I'm not seeing that.
It
I
was
see-
in the it was in the Q&A.
Yeah, it's
It
in the
came up.
Q&A. Yeah, I don't know. And we don't have access to allow people to, this doesn't allow us to bring them in to ask something live. They have to do it in writing, unfortunately.
Well, I hate leaving an
Yeah.
answer or a question out there, but
I know. Well, Brad, tell us everybody how that you're available by email or by the Ohio History Connection. They can reach you that way.
absolutely. And I guess I don't have a means of typing it, but my email address is blepper, BLEPPER, at ohiohistory.org.
Great. Thank you again, everybody. And it's been a fabulous 4 years and there might be more to come. You just never know. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.